We have a very special treat for you. I'm very pleased that these three amazing artists were able to come out here to participate. And we have Jim Isermann, Pei White, and Donald Moffett. And our moderator tonight is Brook Hodge. Brooke organizes exhibitions and writes about design, architecture, art, and fashion. From 2001 to 2009, she was curator of architecture and design at MoCA, where she organized major exhibitions on the work of architect Frank Gehry and car designer Jay Mays, as well as the Skin and Bones Parallel Practices in Fashion and Architecture exhibit, which was a groundbreaking examination of the relationship between contemporary fashion and architecture. Skin and Bones opened in Los Angeles in 2006 and traveled to museums in Tokyo and London and was accompanied by a catalog co-published by Thames and Hudson. Prior to her work at MoCA, Hodge was director of exhibitions and publications at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and she also held positions there as adjunct curator of architecture at the Fogg Art Museum and assistant dean of arts program at the GSD. Brooke holds a master's degree in architectural history from University of Virginia, and she's a regular contributor to Wallpaper magazine and writes Seeing Things, which is an ongoing column for the New York Times Magazine blog. She's currently developing projects with designer and artist Peter Seville and architects Thomas Heatherwick and Rem Koolhaas. And Brooke will introduce each of our guest artists tonight. So please join me in welcoming Brooke Hodge, Jim Isermann, Pei White, and Donald Moffett. Thank you.
It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Donald Moffett, Pei White, and Jim Isermann to speak about their own work and the influence or confluence of Sister Carita's work on their own and on contemporary art in general. And I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we'll get right into our discussion. So from your left to right, we have Donald Moffett, Pei White, and Jim Isermann. So I'm going to start with Donald Moffett. Don Moffett is a New York-based artist and was a founding member of the collective Grand Fury, which created work in the late 1980s and early 1990s addressing issues of the AIDS catastrophe. Moffett also co-founded Bureau, a design studio with Marlene McCarty that functioned as a transdisciplinary experiment from 1989 to 2001. Moffett's own artwork includes textured monochromatic paintings, sometimes combined with video projections and sculptural elements, and austere paintings featuring minimalist spheres and zippers that repair cuts to the canvas. In 2007, Dan Fox wrote in Frieze magazine, "For Moffett, painting is used as a kind of aesthetic compressor, concentrating the very real concerns and complexities of politics and human sexuality into a hard-hitting, high-tension visual experience." The subject of numerous solo shows across the United States and in Europe, Moffett's next major exhibition is a 20-year survey of his work that originates at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh in 2010 and will culminate at the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston in 2012. Next to Don, we have Pei White. Pei is a native Californian who lives and works in Los Angeles. She received her BA from Scripps College and an MFA from Art Center College of Design. White's often whimsical work explores color and space and plays exuberantly between art and design and painting and sculpture. Her practice includes hybrid objects such as sculptural mobiles and chandeliers, painting, sculpture, collage, and public art projects. And her work, which reveals an equal interest in pop culture and high art, is influenced by all things Californian, from West Coast modernism to Hollywood glamour. White describes her work as, quote, amplifying the artfulness of everyday things, unquote, from books and advertising to shopping bags and barbecue grills. White created an ambitious installation called Weaving Unsung for this year's Venice Biennale and has had recent solo shows at 1301 PE here in LA, the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, the Taubman Museum of Art in Roanoke, Virginia, and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. Next, we have Jim Isermann. Jim is a practicing artist based in Palm Springs, California. Since receiving his MFA from the California Institute of Arts in 1980, Isermann's artistic output chronicles the conflation of post-war industrial design and fine art through popular culture. Throughout the 1990s, Isermann explored traditional handicraft techniques to produce works, for example, stained glass, weaving, etc., that are unashamedly beautiful, a beauty that is integral to the limitations and specific characteristics of fabrication. In 1996, following a 15-year survey exhibition at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Institute of Visual Art, Isermann began to use a computer to design manufactured elements. Realized installations and commissions have employed mass-produced thermal die-cut vinyl decals, plotter-cut mylar decals, ContraVision inkjet printed vinyl, and projects incorporating multiple vacuum-formed ABS plastic panels. In 2003, a 35-foot, 5-pendant chandelier, custom carpeting, and furniture selection were permanently installed in the atrium of Genentech Hall at the UCSF Mission Bay campus. Currently, Isermann divides his practice between studio work for gallery and museum exhibitions and designing and overseeing commissioned projects that involve industrial manufacturing processes. Most recently, Isermann has mounted solo exhibitions at Deitch Projects, New York, Corvi Mora, London, and Richard Theus Fine Art here in LA. And that show was just this spring, I believe. Commissioned projects were completed in 2006 for the UCLA Hammer Museum, the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. In 2007 for Yale University Art Museum, 2008 for Princeton University, and in 2009 for Stanford University and UC Irvine? Riverside, sorry. Jim is currently participating in Plug-in number 52 at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. So thank you all for participating tonight. We're going to start with Don. He has an interesting connection to Sister Carita and the Hammer Museum because, as Claudia mentioned earlier, in 2000, Julie Ault, who wrote this book, Come Alive, The Spirit of Sister Carita, organized an exhibition here at the Hammer using works of Sister Carita from the archive in the Grunwald Center, which is part of the Hammer Museum. And Julie decided to pair the work of Don Moffett and Sister Carita. And so, Don, I was wondering if that was your first encounter with Sister Carita, and during the course of the exhibition, what kind of parallels did you notice between your work and hers?
It wasn't my first encounter, but certainly I kind of boned up quickly when we settled in on this was what it was going to be. The way it had actually developed was Julie had wanted to present in out of context of the Village Voice, this Village Voice work, which I'm going to show some of, which was this on deadline art stuff that I made for a column in The Voice for a couple of years called The Age of AIDS. And she had wanted to represent it, and we were trying to find a partner to, because, you know, it's modest work, and it kind of exists as newsprint, and we made kind of iris prints of it to kind of dress it up a little bit for presentation. But we had traveled through, I've been trying to recollect who we kind of went through, and it was like, nah, that's no good. And when she brought the idea of Carita, it was an instant. I knew enough to say yes, okay? I grew up in...
How did you know enough to say yes?
Well, I knew Carita from the provinces, you know. I certainly was not here at this epicenter where Carita is kind of adored and venerated and known deeply. But, I knew her big, broad work, and certainly knew her through the intensive media attention. First time around. I mean, I'm old enough to have been alert to what was going on then. I wasn't too old, but old enough.
Great. So, in terms of parallels between your work and Carita's, and why did you think that was a good match, that you would be paired with Sister Carita?
Yeah,
because I think the exhibition was called Interlocking.
Yeah, which I never really understood.
Well, it was called Power Up, which was from a Sister Carita work, and then the subtitle was Interlocking.
Honestly, I don't really know. I can't tell you what that meant, but actually what I'm going to focus on tonight, and what kind of the immediate connection was around the graphic work. I mean, I don't think there's any real critical debate about those happenings and the Merry Day and the boxes. Those boxes I'll just always love forever. My real connection, though, is through the graphics, and that's where I can bring, I could easily bring my own work, for one thing, that made sense next to the best of her graphics, but I could also bring my critical bitchiness, too. So we'll do both of those tonight.
Okay. So why don't you show us a few things then?
I can do better than that. I can read you a few
Oh,
things.
okay,
I did prepare a few things just because the show is now in some ways in my brain kind of ancient history, but I revisited it. I got Julie's new book and of course read that and have been reading the new edition of the new book.
The Learning by Heart
Learning book
that Claudia mentioned.
But I wanted to just start this off with a bang and say that I find Carita and a lot of her graphics one of the most irritating artists around. And I say that with love, but I do mean it. She's always there to be dealt with in my opinion. She's such a perennial favorite, or it seems like that to me from the outside. Maybe it seems like since I've been here a few days, it kind of goes in these more extended waves than I kind of understand. Like maybe it's a 10-year cycle of loving Carita and then not loving Carita and then back at it.
Or sort of rediscovering her, I
Yeah,
think, because we've all been talking about how her popularity seems to ebb and flow, and it's interesting to sort of, I think in the course of this conversation, to think about why that might be and why at certain times we're kind of drawn back to her work again.
Yeah, and I can fortify what irritates me so much, and that is the way she, in my opinion, she trashed many of her best works with crummy little type. You saw a lot of it in that editing in the movie. You know, I could never really take all that subtext and all that stuff seriously because it was always for me about the big content that she was right there. I mean, you know, the peace and justice stuff. Come on. Well, I'm kind of critical of the little faith-based subtext in relationship to a broader project of great graphics. But, you know, she was like the Hudson River School artist. She would kind of ruin her gorgeous work, as they would, by inserting these itsy-bitsy tiny little people, you know, to kind of somehow scale the big picture, which in their case was nature. In Carita's case, it was certainly kind of justice.
Well, and also probably man and God in her mind, too.
There was all of that, which I just kind of blow over. In fact, I'm going to blow over some of this.
Having heard that gasp from the audience.
Yeah, I can deal with love more. But really, I did have trouble. I just didn't know. I don't oftentimes know how to deal with her, you know, her kind of like artist to be enjoyed type thing.
Well, and also there's that element, I mean, it's a really strong element of her work, this sincerity, which is very genuine, I think, in her case.
True.
And it's interesting because a lot of the work that she was doing at the same time was you know, sort of followed on the heels of Warhol using or doing his drawings for advertising and doing the Campbell's soup cans and the Brillo boxes, but he always had a sense of irony to his work, whereas Carita, you know, was super sincere.
She was.
And so is that one of the things that irritates you?
Yeah, I can say it does. So we've established I'm not a sap or a sucker for Carita, but I also just want to make the point that I don't really feel it's all her fault. I think she fit the bill perfectly for kind of what was needed in the violence of the 60s. You know, if we didn't have Carita, we needed something like it, like, I don't know, possibly a singing nun, or possibly a flying nun, you know, whatever. We just needed something non-threatening in this explosive time. And I think the media embrace really can sometimes be thought of as a reactionary embrace. You know,
also the whole idea of the modern nun, which seemed to fascinate people so much because, you know, it was all of those things were happening around the same time. Julie Andrews and The Sound of Music,
Yeah.
The Flying Nun with Sally Field on TV in 1967, and The Singing Nun, which might predate that a little bit, but we remember it.
beautifully.
But
actually.
but people really had this fascination with this idea of the modern nun, and I think it was the sort of the nun coming out of the cloister and, you know, having a human face and participating in activities that everyone could relate to.
Well, yeah, and you got to admit, that makes my point kind of for me. It was so non-threatening, although now I'm hearing rumblings about, like, within the church, some of the mothers were like, she's a nut, get her out of here. But, you know, it was basically, I think, about kind of reassuring a traumatized middle class. Not necessarily from the inside looking at her, but certainly from the outside and from the fame that kind of propelled her along and kept her afloat. All right, okay. But the big but comes right now around this. And the big but is that I honestly kind of think about Carita every day, oddly enough, because this hangs over the bed. So every kind of, you know, every night when I go to bed, every night when I get up, there she is. My partner and I sleep directly under this serigraph. And, you know, I got my own critical take on it. But let's start at the beginning. I think this is a graphic masterpiece. You know, kind of the white type on slightly bastardized Helvetica black bursting through this cadmium red. The type toys with presenting itself as both foreground and background. Also, I feel kind of as emulsion and image, all kind of simultaneously. This piece obviously does not suffer from her impulse to embed dinky, crummy little type kind of all over it. And you know, she like knocks off very casually kind of knocks off the ascenders, the K, the descenders on the G. She, you know, she kind of foreshadows texting in a way by just casually ejecting a superfluous L, a superfluous S, and she doesn't bother at all with, you know, the trouble of making it any sort of contraction, and yet it remains perfectly and reads perfectly as it should. Now, why it hangs over our bed is what I playfully describe as this poster as a minimalist dream, but I myself, as a post-minimalist, think it's a come shot come true. You know, at least in my case, in our case, if you'd like to interject, just to say it. But you know, it's cheerful lewdness and raunchiness, and it's real image for me of sex. It's Carita at my best. From there, I think it's fair enough to put my own work forward. But I also wanted to make the point, which this film helps me do, or actually the whole kind of gig around Carita helps me do. And that is that, so I think about her every day, religiously. But you know, I consider successes and failures maybe, okay, I focus on her failures plenty. But I focus on her successes, and only then in the context of, say, Ginsberg Joan Mitchell, the painter, her furious work. The 60 chaos of MC5. You can't kind of just hold her out here in this loving arena. To get to what I do with Carita, which is my job, is to dry it way down and to present anger in a much more straightforward. Well, she doesn't deal with anger, and so I do, or I have. This is older work. This was kind of how the work worked. It stood alone, and it was a fairly kind of loose relationship to the text. But let me just show you a couple of these. This was a piece. This too, I have to contextualize. This was the end of, the Reagan years on to Bush 1, and this was in a piece by Larry Kramer, way back when the numbers looked like that. A couple more of these. This was in a Richard Goldstein piece, who was the editor of the series and of the arts, I think, at that time.
And these pieces were done specifically for the context of Village Voice.
Yes.
And these articles.
Yeah, and so this is where this kind of weird idea by Julie's came from. She had watched the illustrations roll out after a couple of years, and she wanted to just see if it was possible to, even though the link, as I say, was also oftentimes very loose, she wanted to see if we could pull them out of this context, represent them in a gallery situation, in a cleaned up thing, and pair it with something else that contextualize it historically. Quickly, it wasn't all about anger. There was the total despair. There was work. Did you see him in the film? This was our Archbishop. And I'm wondering if he's one of the other 6 protesters at Vatican II, because he was a jerk. And we finally got his dead body. He died a while ago. But this was kind of the apex of ACT UP, New York's work in a lot of ways when the protest at St. Patrick's. My work as a contribution was street-oriented, which is different from the Village Voice, which has kind of a private-public dichotomy. This was strictly public and for the street and for the passerby, and also for the protests. They were used in the protests. At the same time, many of us were building kind of art for the gallery. This is a series of drawings called the Cathedral Drawings. It's a series of this one cute pig, and then a series of kind of filthy porn pig Latin, from Odle to Umke to Usje to Adwe, all laid down on the front of the Welcome to St. Pat's. To convince you that I'm a well-rounded person, I can be nice too. And we're ending on just a shot where the Cathedral at St. John the Divine asked me to come up and do an installation there, and I took a blue sky photograph. Looks good, looks nice, right? It was bringing the work all the way inside, but the detail is that, which I'm sure most of you know, is that St. John the Divine is Episcopal. And so it's got a long history of left-leaning progressive politics. So we'll stop there, or I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. I think it's interesting that, I guess, Julie Ault was thinking about the fact that both your work and Carita's, especially her work up to 1970, included a lot, or in your case, includes a lot of political content, social commentary. She did a lot of work that addressed that spoke about peace and hope for peace during the Vietnam War. And in some cases, I think she was asked by IBM to do a Christmas window, and she did one of her installations made out of the cardboard boxes that was all about peace on Earth. And IBM censored it because they thought that it was, she was communicating anti-war sentiments. And she was very nice about that and didn't really refer to it as censorship, and she said she didn't want to be fussy, and in a way that attitude kind of helped her, because after she left the sisterhood, she ended up doing quite a bit of work for IBM and other corporate clients. But what's interesting also is that, and I think in the case of Pei and Jim, this is even more direct, but when I first got to know your work, I knew you more in the guise of bureau, and you were doing a lot of graphic design work. And so there is that interest also in typography, and I think you talked about that, you know, in this sort of clean typography and the relationship between type and image. And in Carita's case, it's really more the interest in typography and sort of juxtaposing different kinds of typography.
Well, you know,
I
also wanted to compliment Carita really on her extravagant innovation around typography. Like when we were talking about the other day, I was trying to think of David Carson, you know, as someone who came along. I don't know, is David Carson from out here? Anyway, he was an innovator well after Carita of just layering and complicating type that seems to me to draw directly from her same impulse to mess it up, especially those beautiful waves of type that she developed, which I know there's probably a fairly simple technique to that, but if you sent me to go do that.
The Carita app.
Right, the Corita app. But you know, that's beautiful stuff that now will never be done by hand again. You know, it's a simple kind of maneuver on the computer, and but she was there way before, and this is beautiful stuff. This is, you know.
Great. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Pei. So Pei, I'm wondering, since you're a native, I think you're the only native California among us up here. I'm wondering what your first encounter was with Carita and what you made of her work and where you saw it and how you saw it.
Well, definitely as someone who grew up in, you know, outside or in the epicenter, I guess, as Don was saying, it made its presence known in sort of three ways for me. And for starters, when I was a kid, growing up in Pasadena in the 60s and 70s, you know, the Pasadena Art Museum was just kind of coming to life. And there was a lot of Catholics also in Pasadena. So I think there was maybe a dilemma of people who wanted to be a part of something dynamic and have some sort of progressive art in their house, but maybe still have the kind of religious infusion. And I really, you know, I can only speak in terms of impressions, but I first came across it in a friend's house. And I just asked, well, you know, this whole corridor of these Carita pieces, and he said, oh, that's the blind nun. Like this kind of collision of what was, you know, going on at the, and I thought, well, the type's so lazy, it probably is true, it makes sense, and that was one impression. And then later I was working for Mike Kelly, and he denies this, but I swear I saw in his house some prints he was working on where instead of the kind of love and religious sentiment and upbeatness, he had substituted that with like fart noises in these kind of serigraphs. So then it was kind of, I was sort of re-informed of Sister Carita, and I had started to collect the work anyway, just like a number of other things I was collecting at the time that I didn't really know anything about. And I wasn't really collecting it to find out more, but I just wanted to get a handle on it somehow, or just have it. For instance, the textile designer Vera, who was just everywhere, and I thought, you know, when I was a kid, and then I just started to buy it, and so when I started to see Sister Carita's work in thrift stores again, I thought, well, there's that woman, I think she's blind. And so I would buy it, it was very cheap. And then I later came across the work again at some friends, Tim and David Tattoo, whose mother worked with Sister Carita. And were saying stories about, she was very difficult. Like all this kind of the magic and all this business about, what a wonder and love and life was kind of compounded with this kind of problematic person. And so those were my sort of gatherings of Sister Carita over my life. And I'm not really sure how her work has influenced mine. I mean, I'll show some images, but definitely coming out of art school at a time when computers were becoming more common. And that was where I got into doing design, is that finally I had a tool that would let me do a book, whereas before I didn't do the ruling pens, I didn't do anything in the traditional graphic way. And so to come out of an art school where everything was really kind of over-designed, and to see something that was so undigital, was sort of refreshing and sort of pushed me forward to buying as many of her books as I possibly could. And as a book designer, I'll show you some images. There might be some influence. Some of the work, the first pieces I'll show, it probably is more obvious, and then I'll just talk about some recent projects, and maybe you'll see some similarities. But okay, I'm going to try to.
I think I just try this. Yeah. No. Let's not try that.
Yeah.
Oh,
You have to go to the, don't you have to go down to the.
Okay.
While you're doing that, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Vera too, because I can see that there's some similarities between Vera and Carita's work, and they're both interested in vibrant color and a sort of loose graphic sensibility. And I think that, hey, haven't you also incorporated Vera
Yes.
pieces into your own work?
In fact, this was at the time that I was using some of my aspects of my collection as sort of a raw material in my own artwork. And this was a piece of one of the things that I was really stunned by, I mean, I came out of art school in the early 90s, was the presence of the word love in an artwork in a really true, sincere, uncynical way. And I found that very, very sort of radical for me. And I wanted to figure out a way to do that and also kind of I don't know, reference my own collecting at the time. And so this was a project in a space in Santa Monica, and it was the first time it was actually my first solo show. And I wanted to have volume, but have it sort of barely there. And I wanted to have the kind of, I mean, maybe the word love is like a slogan, and so to have the format of a billboard and this kind of persuasiveness in this kind of scenario. I guess I do this, right?
Hey, did you say, where'd you go to art school?
Art Center?
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted context.
Oh, yeah, Art Center in Pasadena.
And was anybody talking about Carita
No.
at Art Center? Not at
No.
all at that time, right?
No, still not. But I also was interested in the sort of vernacular. I was working on films a lot, and I was interested in foregrounding some of the things that you aren't supposed to see, like jacks and sandbags, which I found very beautiful. And so here's, I love designing books. I love seeing things printed, and this is sort of an array of books and design pieces, printed matter I've done. It's just kind of in a display case. And I'm not trained as a designer, and that's kind of the nice thing, is I always kind of, as I say when they ask me to do something, you have such a nice, naive style, which is, I have no idea what I'm doing, but anyway, it's still, that's because of computers. This is a project, this is some research that was done for a project at the MTA. I say my largest sculpture I've ever done, which is this bus seat fabric that's on a number of bus lines through Los Angeles, which is proven to be graffiti resistant. And in fact, my husband's and my initials are embedded in this fabric too, and I don't even think the Metro knows.
So next time you ride the Dash, you can look for
Right.
PW and
Exactly.
TM.
This is a fairly recent project for the Opera House in Oslo, where I won the competition for the stage curtain. And I was very interested in this idea of something faking or pretending to be something that it's not, or something that had a dream to be something that it wasn't. So, and I was thinking, why couldn't a big piece of metal just be the stage curtain? Why couldn't it just come down in a heap and go up in a heap? And I came across a technology of of weaving from digital files and presented this crumpled tin foil, just this something from the kitchen, and had a digital file done at a high resolution, and we had it woven, and it's in the Opera House. This is the space, the interior space. And just that maybe something like tinfoil or cotton can dream of being something deep and reflective, or maybe it's the cotton dreaming of being a piece of kitchen foil. But it just was
But
loaded.
it's flat? Is it flat or is it
It's
dimensional?
flat. No, it's totally. In fact, here's someone said, well, traditionally artists sign stage curtains, and that hadn't occurred to me, but it's such a rich, it's such a precise technology that it picked up my fingerprint when I was crumpling the foil. Wow. So there's somewhere
so you
in
did
there.
sign it.
Yeah. This is a recent project. This is in Venice right now. It's a space in the Arsenale from 1300. And it's the oldest space in the Arsenale, which had a lot of restrictions in terms of hanging, and everything you're about to see is suspended in some way without any nails or whatever. And this space was very beautiful to me. It was very open, and I kept thinking of a sort of a collapsed bird cage and birds in the attic, and wanted to figure out a way to do that. And I really have a philosophical issue with artists using animals in their artwork. So I did some research about, had some help with some research about a group of people in the Veneto region called chiocolatori who compete. It's not their full-time job, but as a hobby, they imitate sounds of birds. And they have an exposition every August with some chiocolatori from France and some from Spain. And it's all about precision. And anyway, you'll see what I'm about to show you. So I wanted to force a type of intimacy in this sort of expansive open warehouse. So I did this plan for sort of drop ceiling to kind of force that, but then had penetrations of chandeliers that kind of took you still through this kind of transparent, semi-transparent mesh. And this is from above. This really elaborate framework that they insisted upon to suspend 4 pounds of thread. I mean, it was just really amazing. Nice is that they really look like viewers, so they really blended in, and some people thought they were in the artwork and were angry that birds were trapped in the artwork, but they were just very stealth. And part of my arrangement with this group, or this association, was that I was going to design the poster for their exposition in August.
Had they ever done anything like this before with an artist?
No. But they loved it, and they were fantastic. And so this is just the beginnings of the poster I'm working on now, which sort of takes some of the fabric from the quilts of Geese Bend and reintroduces it into their poster without the text yet. So that is, now I've got to try to get back to your.
And I think recently Pei and Jim participated in an online discussion with each other that you can look at on afterall.org. Through After All magazine, and about Sister Carita. And I think because I see in both your work and Jim's work the connection from the design side, because both of you are very interested in color and form and incorporating design into your work. So it's sort of less about any kind of political or social content, but more about an interest in those elements of design. So we'll move on to Jim, and I just wanted to say also that fellow panelists feel free to jump in and make comments at any time. But I think in the film it came across that people, when they spoke about Sister Carita and about her work, always talked about the happiness and the joyousness and the sense of affirmation that her work communicated. But Jim, you've remarked to me that you always had sense this kind of underlying melancholy to her work, and I thought maybe you could speak about that.
Well, actually, before we look at the images, I'd like to show this brief clip. There was a documentary that was made in the, I guess it was made in the early 90s by Eva Marie Saint and her husband. And this was before the kind of legend of, or the myth of Carita was in place. And people were a lot more free about talking about, you know, the other side of Carita. So I just wanted to show 2 minutes from this. And it also shows some more footage of the Boston gas tank, which is a really inspirational public project. So if we can run that bit.
But I love that gas tank. It's a joke. It's a wonderful, humorous prank. To me, it said exactly what Carita was always saying to us about this environment around us. Don't discard it. Don't escape it. Pick it up, use it, play with it, paint on it, and live with it.
Many people who knew Corita just thought that she was all bright colors and a wonderful smile and a laugh, and was not true.
You have down moments like the rest of us?
Oh, yes, most of the time, yes.
Most of the time are down moments?
Most of the time at work, I think, yes. And as for the whole life, I don't know if I've ever figured it out mathematically. I think life is good, but it doesn't always look that way.
Life is good. You believe that life is good in your better moments.
Good, yes.
Are there moments when you lose that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Then how does life look?
Then life doesn't look too good.
Well, let me talk about a couple things, and then I'll show you some images. Oh, thank you. I grew up in Wisconsin. I grew up Catholic, so Carita's influence on the graphic style of, you know, what was then the Catholic Church was something I probably recognized before I knew that she was, you know, responsible for it. And when I moved to California to go to grad school is probably the first time I put her name to that type of imagery. There's a lot of things I really like about Carita's work. I really like the quality of how her work defines that contemporary landscape of the 60s without exactly describing it. How its relationship to popular culture and all those great clips from the previous documentary about them looking at the supermarket and the landscape around them, and you know the learning by heart is kind of a textbook way of looking at the world that way. But what's amazing about that book is when you look at it, all of the virtually none of the examples of the built environment exist that spawn that work. And so Pei and I have fantasized about teaching that book, but having the imagery reflect, you know, what the world looks like today, which would be obviously produce a totally different kind of output. One of the things I love about Carita's work is how it was available at every price point. She made postcards, greeting cards, offset, you know, posters, lots of books, open edition prints, editioned prints. When you go through the Carita Center and you look at the serigraphs, there would be one image from a many-layered print, and on every other print it would be going in a different direction.
Can I say one thing? At the Carita Center, I noticed, and I'm sure it's gone now, but there was a drawer that said OBO for anybody who wanted to just
really?
make an
Or-
offer. Yeah,
wow.
I think it's a long.
Yeah, I don't know if that exists any longer. But then there were also prints that could be hung in any orientation, and so when you look through that print, the signature would be on any side because it was the text went every which way, so no matter which way you hung it, part of the text would be, right side up. So there's things about that I really love. When you watch this other documentary, which is called Primary Colors, they talk about another reason, which isn't mentioned that much now, about one of the reasons why Carita left the Immaculate Heart was that she was in love, and that she, according to this documentary, was in love with a priest, and she left the sisterhood, but he did not leave the priesthood, and that this left her, brokenhearted. And so there's this melancholy or darker side to her that's not explored very much today.
And she was also an insomniac.
Yeah, she was
She talked a lot
complete
about that.
insomniac, which they're always happy to talk about that because that's why she was so productive.
Right. 'Cause
But,
she worked at all hours of the day.
there's a downside
But,
to not
yeah.
getting any sleep. So I think that's interesting. And, this is kind of old school, but, being a gay man of a certain age, it's easy to identify with the heroine who gives up everything for love, especially when it's unrequited love. So there's that, which is like, the perfect mix for a kind of gay icon.
Do you think that because a lot of people have remarked that after she left in the sisterhood in 1968, I think,
Right.
and after 1970, her work kind of lost a lot of its power, or sort of the message wasn't as strong.
It took a little while. I mean, in this other documentary, they talk about that first year, about how many prints she made and how optimistic they were because it was about this future she was anticipating. And then when that didn't come true, that's, I think, when it really changed. And it's interesting in the documentary we watched tonight because they talk about the pastels and her slowing down. But in the previous documentary, she talks about that first summer when she left, that she made 90 prints that summer. And so it was a tremendous output.
And the woman in the documentary was talking about how she did all the kind of arduous physical work of the printmaking herself.
Right. Well, it's really interesting. It's hard to know what drove that work from the mid to late 60s, which is clearly the strongest work. Everyone talks about this Sister Mag, who was clearly the driving force behind her at Immaculate Heart, but I don't know. I think there was a very collaborative process that was going on in the school, working with the students, working with the other people teaching there, and I think that changed a lot when she was on her own. And in that film, she talks about doing these prints via the mail, where she was sending these images to a commercial silkscreen place that would actually print them, and she'd been doing them for 2 years with this person before she actually went and did work in-house with them. So she had a very, it was a very different kind of process at the time. But one of the other things I really like about her is the secular work. And when you talked earlier with Don about sincerity, I think it's kind of interesting to think about that sincerity applied to Spice Islands and to Westinghouse and to Samsonite.
Can you describe what Spice Islands is? And
I have some
Okay,
images
great.
of that, so
Okay.
we'll get to that. But let's look at the couple images I have. So I just brought images in of 2 recent projects, and this was a project for the MTA Customer Service Center, which is on the corner of Wilshire and La Brea. And most of you probably aren't old enough to remember, but this when this building was built in the late 40s, it was a Welton Beckett designed coffee shop. And if the Wilshire subway line ever is built, this will be a subway station. And so at some point, the MTA acquired it, assuming it would be torn down. And then that Ross Dress for Less shop blew up on Fairfax, and they realized they were going to have a hard time putting a subway line in. So after this kind of stucco entombment of this beautiful early modern coffee shop, it was just gray stucco, and they realized that this building was going to be there for a while, and they wanted a project that would make it look better. And what I chose to do was work with this kind of ubiquitous, California idea of these modular metal screens that would cover an offensive, out-of-date building. But what was really great about this is we just covered the top portion of the building. So you still see the offensive remodel of the building. You see this, well, which I think I'm very happy with the project, in terms of transforming the upper half of the building. And actually, if you walk around the corner, there is a huge section of the original building, the original materials. It's all painted a color now. But so there's one section where you see all three layers of the building. So it deals with this idea of adaptive reuse, and I have a great interest in architectural preservation as well. So I mean, one of the things I'm crazy about and admire about Carita is this way of incorporating contemporary culture into her work, which is something I don't think I'm very good at, but it's something I really look at in other people's. This is a detail. It was actually one shape that was powder coated in 3 different colors. This was a project from last year that was for an exhibition called Intervention Decoration that was in a small town in the UK, which was originally a textile mill town, which had all gone out of business in the 60s, and there were still all these boarded up old mill buildings. And they invited a number of artists to do these interventions in the city. And I designed this poster that was based on a combination of some of the last textile work that was produced at these mills. And then the posters, they were just offset posters. When printed and lined up next to each other, they became this repeating pattern that kind of resonated with the history of the building, or with the history of the town, but at the same time made these boarded up buildings look a little bit better. And this amazing moment happened where these kids showed up. I mean, they look like they could be right outside of the Hammer, right? But these are kids in the middle of the UK, showed up with their skateboards and wanted some of the posters to put on the bottoms of their boards. And they gave them the posters on the condition that they come back to be photographed, which I was amazed that they did. So this was great. And then I just have a couple images of the Spice Islands. This was actually the first Carita that I collected. I found this international dining with Spice Islands in a thrift store in Palm Springs. And I waited till their summer sale where I got it for half price.
Smart. 50 cents.
But what it is, it's a collection of 10 booklets, and this is the introductory booklet. And I have to apologize for the poor matching. I scanned it in the front and back, and then just put it back together in the PowerPoint. But there was this introductory one, and then there were 9 menus, each with a different country theme. And so this was the French proverb. So I really like that she brings the same or an equal amount of sincerity to a cookbook cover as she does to the work that has this more religious take to it. It's funny though, Don was talking about having a Carita above his bed, and I actually have one as well, hanging above my bed.
Which one do you have?
I don't have an image of it here tonight, but it has a little bit of the little tiny writing.
Is it in here?
Is it?
It's not in that book.
Is it open wide? That's the other one I love.
No. It has one single large word, alive, which I think is a nice thing to see in the morning when you wake up. So
I think when you were
So-
talking about seeing the sincerity and the sort of different places that her work appeared, I was also thinking about how she also had a sense of humor too about her own work, and she, for her own Christmas card one year, I think she used the phrase, "He cares enough to send the very best," referring to the Lord, but taking the phrase from Hallmark or something.
Well, it was funny when Pei and I were going through all the prints there a year or so ago. There was one tagline that said, "Somebody up there likes us," with a little jet airplane flying by. But then there was another one that said, "Somebody up there loves you," and so I didn't know why were you liked in one poster and loved in another. So, and they were disturbed when I asked one of the people at the foundation about that.
Did you get a discount if you're liked?
I guess so. But I did want to mention one other of her products that Pei and I saw for the very first time actually in Power Up, the show that Don was in with Carita. And that was this prototype suitcase that Carita had worked on doing a set of luggage for Samsonite that was her imagery on the side of those hard, plastic vinyl suitcases they used to make. And when we saw that in the exhibition, we thought it was a production line, and we spent a number of years, hoping to come across that in a thrift store. But when we were in the Carita Foundation, we mentioned it to them, and they opened up a closet, and there it was. And it turned out to be completely a prototype. It didn't have any guts to it when we opened it up. It was just the raw insides of the outsides. But it was a really amazing object, and maybe someday that will go.
Yeah, I think Pei mentioned that Marc Jacobs had actually approached the Carita Foundation or Carita Art Center about maybe putting it into production for, I don't know, for his own line or for Louis Vuitton, but
Or just using the fabric. So it wouldn't be the suitcase without wheels that we fell in love with. It would be surely a wheelie.
or a dress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess if there was anything else, well, there's two other points I'd like to make quickly. One is just this idea, her idea of equating this high-low thing, which is, very, I mean, it's kind of boring now because there's so many artists who deal with the conflation of high-low, popular culture, fine art. And, it was in the air at the time that she used it. I mean, clearly pop art dealt with this, but I think with her work, it also went hand in hand with this idea of using this marginalized media of silkscreen printing, and because of its inexpensive availability.
And it was something that she could do herself. She didn't really need to buy special equipment. She could make that herself.
Yeah, and the fact that she was also able to do a lot of this outside of the gallery system. I don't really know. I mean, clearly she had museum shows, but I don't know what kind of museums those were, and I don't know exactly.
At the time, I think that she was active. I'm not sure, but I think after she died, I think then she was recognized more.
Well, it's changed a lot now. I mean, she showed a lot at the time, but she also had the wherewithal to open her own gallery. So she kind of bypassed the gallery system, and she had her own gallery out in North Hollywood for years and years, where you would go and buy her work. So
I had a question that anybody could answer, and that is the timeline such that the information kind of thread leads in only one way between her and Warhol, and it's Warhol to her, or is it more confused than that? Because Warhol was
probably more confused than that, I think.
Warhol was such a kind of serious Catholic, serious lapse Catholic. You know, it was so kind of embedded in the whole thing. I'm just curious about if that's ever been sussed out. 'Cause it would,
I don't think, I've always seen it sort of mentioned in passing.
in passing.
More in terms of the content side of things, and then his sort of use of script in his earlier work and her use of it more in her later work. But
Maybe Immaculate Heart was her factory.
It was. It was.
Definitely
Yeah.
was.
and she had happenings there. I think, Jim, also maybe you could say something about, I think when you were all coming into the theater tonight, there were some images on the screen, and those were from the Carita's book called Footnotes and Headlines, and that's why the title of this panel is Footnotes and Headlines. And maybe you could talk a bit about that book, because you've said that you really admire.
Well,
that.
she did a lot of book design, but that was well, she did a lot of book designs that incorporated other people's writing, and that was the first book I believe that she did that was almost entirely her writing. There was a foreword by Daniel Berrigan, but it was a book that she designed, and it was called a play prayer book. But it was also, predates learning by heart in terms of, it was also instructions on how to do this yourself. And I think the way each one of those pages is laid out is as complicated as one of these posters. And so, again, putting an equal amount of work into something that was, relatively inexpensive and available to a wide market or wide audience.
Maybe since we're getting close to time to end, we should talk a little bit about what maybe each of you could say a bit about what you think her legacy is, whether it's as an artist or a teacher, and what her influence has been on other artists as well as on your own work.
Let's go in reverse order.
Well,
not?
I mean, I have to say,
I guess one
today,
quick-
today I
sorry.
walked through Larry Johnson's show, and I mean, I just thought, why isn't Larry up here tonight? I mean, I thought there's, I have no idea whether he was how much he may have been aware of her work, but there's clearly a relationship to what he did with typography and just arrangements of all those gorgeous colors.
Yeah, it's interesting that this panel is happening at the same time as
Yeah.
his show. I'm not sure if that was intended or not, but it's a nice confluence. And Carita was never really recognized or accepted, I guess, as a fine artist. She was always considered something of a folk artist or a sort of cult figure eventually. And do you think that has changed, or do you think will change? Or do you think that films like the film that we saw at the beginning kind of perpetuate that idea of her?
I think she's been sort of, she's reached the highest level with Wolfgang Tillman showing her in London at his exhibition space. And so, as someone who probably one of the lone artists at the Corita Center exhibition board, I'm the one who's kind of constantly trying to fight the desire, and I feel like the joy kill to like have Barney's just use her style and reduce her work to just a style.
Right.
And I see that as a tendency that, I mean, you can't really control, but it's the one that I really try to rally against, because I think I think a lot of the commercial interest in the past, like even, Marc Jacobs, has been simply for a season. And
Right. Well, because especially with fashion, it's so fleeting.
yeah, so it's a kind of a tricky legacy. I mean, it's from my point of view. I mean, I'll keep collecting it if it's cheap enough, but
And was her work ever adapted into textile? Well, that
I
cloth
think it's
for
been
the
borrowed.
suitcase,
When I came across her work, over and over again with like a sort of weird gestalt, it was sort of like, well, yeah, this is it's been lifted in so many ways, and when I kind of trace it back to her, it's like, well, yes, but she was the one who invented this style, much like Warhol's fashion illustrations that was
Right.
imitated, and then you realize, well, yes, but it all started with him.
Yeah, and also there's something about her work that was in the air, I think, in the 60s, and you see it in some of those 60s and 70s, some of those really bright, bold graphic prints from Marimekko and
Well, and you
and
think of
also
all
Vera
the students. I was on an airplane sitting next to an engineer for work for Parsons, and we started talking. He said, "Oh yeah, I was a student of Sister Carita's." Like the most unexpected people, you know, are
Went
taking
through
this
that
into the
school.
world. And
I think a stronger line could be drawn, though, between her her skill as a teacher and separating that out, which is you know so serious. Her ability to teach. I mean, I think that's
and I think the
clear,
way
and
that she taught was really kind of revolutionary then
yeah, it
too.
makes you a little crazy that we can't claim to have been there a little bit too. But you know, I think it gets a little intertwined about her greatness as a teacher and maybe her greatness as a 20th century artist. Speaking of killjoys, but yeah, I have a little trouble there. And it's funny that I would be even saying that because, you know, at Bureau, we kind of fought as two artists forming this design studio. We fought that battle all along. We hated the idea that there couldn't be kind of this simple crossover and intermixing. But this is a special case.
I think with her teaching, and it's a must to see this documentary that Jim showed a clip of, and I only saw half of it, but this kind of swarm, I mean, the teaching that infiltrated the school, and it becomes actually kind of spooky because it sort of turns into a mob where, you know, the fathers have like flowers in their hair, and, you know, these people are kind of almost hypnotized in this, in this frenzy, and you think, well, you know, this is you know, has a potential there of great darkness too. And I think it's really interesting that it hasn't really been discussed, that the seductiveness, I mean, she was such an iconoclast, and these people who are that way are very persuasive. But
Maybe that's a good note to end on, and we'd be happy to take questions from the audience. And I think that there's somebody with a microphone. So if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question, then the microphone can come to you.
It was a wonderful panel, and I learned a lot of things. I have two comment questions. The first, didn't she die of breast cancer in 1986? And
She died of cancer. We
We
weren't
were just
sure
asking
which
that
kind
question
of
ourselves.
cancer
We
it
don't know
was.
what kind of cancer, but the answer is yes. Cancer
and so in
86.
1984, I would assume when that clip you showed, she must have been diagnosed by then, and that would have contributed clearly. It's not just the priest didn't leave, but here she was dying.
No. Yeah, I agree. She had lots to be depressed about in 1984, but there's more clips in that film that talk about, you know, her state of mind, you know, through her entire life, you know. But, you know, so I think I think there's a lot of artists who you know, channel whatever unhappiness or melancholy they have in their life into their artwork, and it's often it can be superficially misunderstood as being very happy and cheerful, where there is this kind of underlying sense of melancholy.
Or yearning, probably,
Yeah.
too. In her
Yeah.
case.
And my other question is, I saw the show in 2000, and at first I was saying, okay, because obviously very opposite, you and her. And then I had this, and I don't know if it was, you know, how much I was projecting, how much was intentional. One never knows that. But that both of you were extremely subversive and and screaming out in the way you knew how, both of you. Her scream was much more subtle.
Colorful.
And colorful and cloaked in love and peace, but it was still subversive. And she was expressing rage and subversion, attempting subversion of her time. You were doing the same thing in the midst of the AIDS crisis. So I saw the two of you as a comparison of rage and subversion reflecting your periods. And I think we haven't really talked about her subversion, because in the midst of these, you know, colors was the Daniel Ellsberg quote, "Wouldn't you go to jail to stop a war?" Makes you think. If you think, that's the beginning of subversion. Or the Camus quote, I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice. It makes you think. And this was right when the U.S. was clearly, the Vietnam War, the discrediting of democracy. So I think that her subversion, I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about how her art was very subversive.
Well, I think selectively you couldn't be more dead on. And I also think that you're right at the core of how that show came to be, because it was through that selective loving of her particular cry that made sense to me for that, and made sense to Julie for the show to happen. I agree with you totally that there is deep subversion there, and even maybe on many different levels than just those quotations. It was her own activities. Clearly, it's easy to kind of see that within the church. She was kind of shut down, or they attempted to shut down, and it ended badly, frankly.
Didn't the whole IHM kind of
that's what
disassociated
yes,
itself
that's what I was referring to. The whole thing, the whole project kind of failed in relationship to its subversion within the Catholic Church. I don't think there's any way else to kind of frame it. But certainly there's a larger world in the Catholic Church, and that's where I think her success radiates.
Before I forget to mention it, I actually just read that there's going to be a retrospective exhibition of Carita's work at the Cathedral here in Los Angeles.
There you go. Okay, all right.
In September.
Okay, she's
So
back,
she's
and
back
she
in
won.
The church.
She won in the
she
end.
Won, yeah. Other questions? Right here.
One second, please.
Or we can give you.
In stereo.
I grew up in Memphis, and my father had an art gallery, and he showed Sister Carita's work, and I have all of his, whatever he had left, and she would write on the back of the posters, "Dear one," and just was really amazing part of my sister's and my childhood. So I went down to the Corita Center to find out about this show, and I'm a writer, and I wanted to know more. And I was amazed at the last thing she worked on. It says when you come in there, was the phrase, "Yes, we can." Mm-hmm. And apparently they have sent something to President Obama.
Great.
Is there anything at the Vatican?
I don't know. That's a good question. It'd be great to find out.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions or stories about, are there people here that studied with Carita? Anything you'd like to add to what we've heard already?
I think the only thing I would say is what comes across in that movie. Wait for the mic.
It's so hard with any artist to understand it all in context about how wild it was at the time, what she was doing. There was an amazing little show out at Northridge, which is what that last film we saw was done for, and there's an incredible letter from the church really truly shutting her down and talking about, she's anti-pious and things like. It's hard to have context now, so many years later. But the only thing I would say is she bore a lot of weight because she did become sort of an icon, and I think she just finally, for whatever, lots of complicating reasons, but I think she just really tried to flee that because she really didn't want to bear that too much longer.
Great, thank you.
Well, yeah, I think the whole thing was kind of an accident for her. I mean, she never wanted to teach. She went into the sisterhood to escape reality, and then she got, this is what they wanted her to do, and she ended up being amazing at it. But it was, and then all this attention. So, her ability all backfired in terms of making her happy.
And I think that was, the Sister Magdalene Mary, that was almost like her manager, had her on this very kind of brutal schedule of appearances and exhibitions and lectures and workshops. And I think that she found that, you know, in addition to creating her work, found that really taxing. And so that was one of the reasons why she really, when she left the sisterhood, really kind of withdrew somewhat and really kind of scaled back her production quite a bit. Oops, right here on the, oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm just going to, I think that sometimes, I mean, you've been talking about the dichotomy of her work, but I think
can you hold it a bit?
That some of the things that mislead you is the bright colors, you're thinking it's happiness, but I think what she was really about was work. I mean, it wasn't, you know, it was work. She got up every day, she worked. And peace, you had to work for it. It didn't just happen. So, you know, I think that that's something that you get misled with the happy colors.
I think that's true. I think that that's why a lot of people associate those qualities with her work.
I've been collecting Carita's works for many years, and just a little plug for the Corita Art Center, that they sell quite a bit of her artwork, and it's very, very, very reasonable for those who are interested in acquiring something of hers that's very inspiring. And you know, I don't have any stuff over my bed, but I have it around my walls in my bedroom, and it's one of those things that literally, like, daily, something about Carita comes up, and there's something just by looking at her artwork that's very inspiring, kind of like a yantra for those who are familiar with yogic meditations and stuff like that. There's something very inspiring about looking at her stuff that has a message that comes through, and the Carita Art Center has quite a bit of her artwork that is very reasonably priced. So check them out.
And that's, well, you can find it pretty easily on the internet, the address. It's in Los Feliz on Franklin, and it's open Monday through Friday. And because it's a very small staff, if you plan to visit, you should call first just to make sure they're open. Julie, I think, did you have a question?
My piece, I just realized it's in my dining room now, but it used to be over my bed. It's a 4-piece. It says, "Be of love, a little more careful than of everything." But besides the center here, the collection, where else are there, like, major public collections?
Well, I think here at the Grunwald Center and then the Corita Art Center are the two major collections. I mean, I think the Corita Art Center has a lot, probably more of the personal archive, and then the Grunwald Center has an amazing number of serigraphs here.
But are there, because I haven't seen much in museums.
I think her work is in the collection of other museums, because she did show her work at LACMA. She showed her work at, I think, at the Fogg in Cambridge, at Harvard some time ago, because she was living in Boston. So it is definitely in the collection of museums, but I think in terms of the largest holdings, that it would be here and at the Corita Art Center.
Well, a lot of museums have been buying up with this recent resurgence, like the Ludwig, and I know the Hirshhorn was interested, MoMA. They're buying portfolios, so they're not just buying one piece, they're buying suites. And the Corita Center has put aside choice portfolios for this purpose, to get it in big institutions.
And we'll take one more question up at the back on the right, on my right. Did you have a question?
Oh, I just had a second, but if somebody wants.
I thought there, okay. No, I thought somebody behind you had.
Some of her political stuff is also at the Center for the Study of Political Graphics in LA, but it's just primarily, her focusing on her political work. You probably have most of that here as well, but the more personal and that stuff is not in there, but the Center for the Study of Political Graphics.
Hey, well, thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And thanks to our
Thank you very much.
Thanks to our panelists for a great discussion.
Thanks.